He had already buried his wife, and with her, most of his past. The war, the noise, the man he used to be. He thought grief was finished with him, but love wasn't. Love asked for one last thing. Not revenge, not answers, just a promise, and a journey guided by a dog, and a quiet faith he believed was long gone. Sometimes God doesn't heal us by removing the pain. Sometimes He asks us to carry it somewhere meaningful. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Let's see how far one act of kindness can go. A biting January wind swept through the gray city streets, carrying the scent of exhaust and impending snow. Inside the small, quiet house, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of things unsaid and years of shadows that refused to lift from the corners of the rooms. Elias stood by the window, his silhouette etched against the dim morning light, like an old oak tree that had weathered too many lightning strikes. He was a man built of hard angles and weathered surfaces, his frame still carrying the rigid, uncomfortable posture of a soldier, despite the decades that had passed since he last felt the weight of a rifle in the deserts of the early 90s. At 62, his face was a complex map of canyons and ridges. Deep-set lines radiated from the corners of eyes that were the color of cold ash after a fire, reflecting a weariness that sleep could never touch. A jagged star-shaped scar, faded to a pale silver, traced a path from his temple down to his jawline, a permanent souvenir from a nameless ridge where the world had once ended for him. He was dressed in his usual uniform of civilian life, a sturdy beige canvas jacket that smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco, and dark charcoal chinos that showed the wear of a man who preferred movement to rest, strictly avoiding the casual comfort of denim. Elias was a man of long silences, his voice having grown rusty and sparse from disuse, a stark contrast to the thunderous, chaotic noise of artillery that still echoed in the back of his mind. His PTSD was not a guest in his house. It was the foundation, a constant low-frequency hum that made his hands tremor whenever the city sirens wailed too loudly or when the night grew too still. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as if afraid that a sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace he had built out of grief and isolation. Beside him, sitting with a stoic grace that mirrored his master's, was Scout. The German shepherd was nearing his 8th year, his once jet-black muzzle now frosted with a dignified, snowy gray that gave him the appearance of a wise old sage. Scout was not merely a pet, he was a four-legged anchor, a guardian of his master's sanity who could smell the rising adrenaline of a night terror before Elias even realized he was dreaming. The dog had a heavy, muscular build, his coat thick and coarse, designed for the rugged outdoors and freezing mountain streams, rather than the carpeted confines of a suburban living room. His eyes, a deep knowing amber, never strayed far from Elias, watching the man's hands and the subtle tension in his shoulders with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. Scout's personality was one of quiet, unwavering vigilance. He was a soldier in fur, possessing a stubborn streak that manifested whenever he sensed Elias was drifting too far into the fog of his own memories. He didn't bark for trifles, but when he did, his voice was a deep, authoritative command of reality that could pull Elias back from the darkest trenches of his mind. On the wooden kitchen table lay a singular object that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. An old, hand-drawn map. It was the final work of Sarah, the woman who had been Elias's son for 40 years before her light was extinguished by a quiet, relentless illness 6 months prior. In his mind's eye, Elias could still see her, Sarah with her long silver-blonde hair that she wore in a loose, effortless braid that always seemed to catch the light, and skin that looked like porcelain lit from within. She had been a woman of soft curves and iron will, a gardener who believed that every weed had a story and every stone had a heartbeat. Her eyes had been a vibrant, startling green, the color of new moss after a spring rain, and they were the only thing that could ever truly quiet the roar of battle in Elias's soul. She had been tall and lithe, moving through her gardens with a grace that made the flowers seem to lean toward her. She had drawn this map in her final weeks, her fingers trembling with effort, but her spirit as clear as glass. It didn't lead to a treasure of gold, but to a remote, windswept cliff overlooking a frozen lake, hundreds of miles to the north. She had whispered to him that the breath of the stones there would do what the doctors and the metals never could. It would carry his grief away and let the stars speak to his soul once more. The task of packing the old truck was a rhythmic ritual, a way for Elias to keep his hands from shaking and his mind from wandering into the what-ifs of history. He moved with a mechanical precision, stowing a heavy wool blanket, a gallon of water, and a small crate of supplies with the same focus he once used to strip a rifle. Yet, every time he approached the passenger door, Scout refused to budge. The dog stood like a statue on the gravel driveway, his ears pinned back, his gaze fixed intently on the house with a stubbornness that would have been humorous if the situation weren't so dire. Elias called to him, his voice a gravelly rumble that felt heavy in his throat, but Scout remained motionless, a furry picket line of one. This was not a typical display of canine defiance. It was a spiritual intervention. Elias wiped a hand over his face, feeling the grit of exhaustion in his pores. He followed the dog's gaze back into the house, through the open door, toward a small wooden box sitting on the mantelpiece. Inside that box lay a silver harmonica, its reeds worn, its surface tarnished by the salt of sweat and the passage of time. That harmonica was a relic of a life Elias had sworn to bury in the deepest part of his heart. It had once belonged to Miller, a kid no older than 19, with a face full of freckles and a laugh that made everyone forget they were in a war zone. Miller had been short and wiry, with an energy that seemed to vibrate even in sleep, and he had played that harmonica in the muddy trenches to keep the platoon's spirits from shattering during the long, terrifying nights when the sky rained fire. Elias could still hear the haunting melodic strains of Wayfaring Stranger drifting through the smoke. Miller had been the heart of their unit, the one who could find humor in a cold ration tin. When Miller had fallen during a chaotic retreat, his blood staining the silver instrument, Elias had tucked it into his pocket, a heavy weight that had remained there for every mile of his journey home. He had vowed never to play it, never to touch it again, for to breathe life into those reeds was to summon the ghosts of the men he had failed to bring home. To Elias, the harmonica was not an instrument. It was a vessel for the screams of the fallen. "We don't need it, Scout," Elias muttered, his voice cracking like dry wood under pressure. But the dog let out a low, insistent whine, a sound of deep-seated mourning that vibrated in the cold morning air. Scout knew, with the primal instinct of a creature tied to the soul, that the journey would be hollow if the heaviest burden remained behind on a dusty mantle. The map was the destination, but the harmonica was the key to the lock on Elias's heart. Elias felt a flare of anger in his chest, a hot, sharp spark of the old soldier's temper that quickly cooled into a dull, aching despair. He realized then that Sarah must have known this too. In her final days, she had mentioned the instrument, calling it the voice of your brothers, and had urged him to let the wind at the lake take the music back. She knew that he was carrying a silence that was killing him, and only the music of the dead could break it. With heavy, reluctant steps that felt like he was walking through knee-deep mud, Elias retreated into the house. The silence of the hallway felt like a physical weight, pushing against his chest and making it hard to breathe. He reached for the wooden box, his fingers hovering over the lid before finally lifting it. The silver instrument caught the weak morning light, looking cold and indifferent to his decades of suffering. As he picked it up, the metal felt like ice against his palm, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the smell of gunpowder and wet earth filled his senses, and the ground seemed to shake beneath his feet. He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Carry it somewhere meaningful, Elias," Sarah's voice whispered in the quiet corridors of his mind, soft but unbreakable. "Don't leave them in the dark anymore. Take them to the light where they can finally rest." He tucked the harmonica into the inner pocket of his beige jacket, right over his heart, where its cold surface slowly began to warm against his skin. It felt like a lead weight, yet strangely, his hands stopped shaking. As he stepped back out onto the driveway, Scout's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The dog let out a sharp, affirmative bark, a sound of pure triumph, and leaped into the passenger seat of the truck, his tail thumping a rhythmic beat against the worn upholstery. Elias climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a familiar, mechanical roar that drowned out the city's distant, judgmental hum. He looked at the map one last time, tracing the delicate line Sarah had drawn to the distant cliff where she believed the stars were said to touch the earth. As the truck pulled away from the curb, leaving the gray, suffocating grid of the city behind, Elias didn't look back. He was a man fleeing not from his past, but toward a final, sacred reckoning with it. The road ahead stretched out like a long, winding ribbon of uncertainty, cutting through the encroaching wilderness where the trees grew tall and the sky opened up into a vast, terrifying blue. He felt the cold weight of the harmonica against his chest, a rhythmic reminder of the promise he was finally keeping. The journey to the frozen lake was not just a trip across hundreds of miles, but a bridge being built between the living and the dead. He wasn't sure if stones could truly breathe or if a lake could heal a soul shattered by iron and fire, but for the first time in years, the noise in his head felt a little less like a battle and a little more like a song waiting to be played. He gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while Scout rested his chin on the dashboard, both of them moving toward the silence of the north. The mountain air was a sharp, crystalline knife that sliced through the lungs with every breath, a cold so pure it felt like inhaling ground glass. To the north, the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of a blizzard that had been chasing them since the foothills. The forest here was a cathedral of ancient towering pines, their boughs groaning under the weight of a silence that felt older than human memory, a stark contrast to the metallic roar of the city Elias had left behind. The old truck groaned as it climbed the final, jagged incline of the mountain pass, the tires spitting gray gravel into the yawning abyss of the valley below. Elias sat white-knuckled at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the narrow, treacherous ribbon of dirt that Sarah had traced on her map with such delicate hope. They were deep in the maw of the wilderness now, far from the reach of cell towers and the comforting hum of civilization. Before reaching the final trailhead, they had stopped at a weathered outpost, a lean-to structure made of cedar logs that smelled of wood smoke, wet fur, and dried blood. It was there that Elias encountered Silas Thorne, the last human soul he would see before the silence took over. Silas was a man who seemed to be carved from the mountain itself, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with a frame as lean and tough as a winter-starved wolf. His face was a landscape of deep-seated wrinkles, his skin the texture of cured leather, and his left eye was clouded by a milky, opaque cataract that gave him an eerie, prophetic appearance. He wore a grease-stained flannel shirt and heavy wool trousers that had seen better decades, his movements slow and deliberate, hampered by a permanent limp he had earned in a logging accident 40 years ago. Silas was a man who lived in the gaps between words, a hermit by choice, whose only companions were the mountain lions he occasionally glimpsed in the high timber. He had looked at Elias's beige canvas jacket and the gray-muzzled German shepherd with a gaze that was neither friendly nor hostile, merely observant. He had pointed toward the upper peaks with a gnarled finger, grunting a warning that the breath of the stones was colder than any city man could imagine. Elias had merely nodded, a silent acknowledgement between two men who had long ago traded the world for the sanctuary of solitude. By mid-afternoon, the truck could go no further, its engine ticking as it cooled in a small, shadow-drenched clearing. Elias began the grueling trek toward the distant cliff on foot. The terrain was a brutal mistress, composed of sheer granite faces and treacherous scree slopes that shifted like sand under his boots. He carried a heavy iron spade slung over his shoulder, a tool he intended to use to fulfill Sarah's final request, to bury a small sealed urn of her favorite wildflower seeds at the very edge of the precipice, so they might catch the wind and bloom where the earth met the stars. But the ground was not the soft, forgiving loam of Sarah's garden. It was frozen iron, a mixture of permafrost and compressed stone that defied his every effort. Each time he drove the spade into the earth, a jarring shock vibrated up his arms, rattling his teeth and sending flares of white-hot pain through his scarred shoulder. His hands, though calloused by years of labor and war, began to blister and bleed through his leather gloves, the crimson stains soaking into the fabric of his sleeves. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the psychological weight of the harmonica in his pocket, But as the hours bled into evening, a bone-deep exhaustion began to set in, a heavy gray fog that threatened to pull him down into the snow. Scout, however, was restless, his instinct far sharper than any map. While Elias struggled with the unyielding earth, the dog was busy pacing the perimeter of a narrow rock crevice a few yards away. He was whining, a low, melodic sound of discovery, and his powerful paws were frantically tearing at the frozen moss and loose shale. Elias, frustrated and on the verge of giving up, watched as the dog's persistence finally revealed something tucked deep within the shadows of the stone. It was a metal box, its surface a rusted orange, the lid fused shut by decades of oxidation and winter ice. With a groan of effort, Elias used the sharp edge of his spade to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in a rotting piece of oilcloth that smelled of ancient dust, was a stack of letters dated from the autumn of 1945. They were written in a delicate, loopy script using faded purple ink, the words of a woman named Clara Vance. Elias sat on a cold stone, his breath hitching as he read the pleas of a mother writing to a son, Thomas, who had never returned from the Great War. Clara Vance, as Elias imagined her through her words, was a woman of immense fragile faith, someone who sat by her window in a small Midwestern town every evening, waiting for a shadow that never lengthened across her porch. She wrote of the apple trees blooming and the way the house felt too large without his laughter, her grief so raw and timeless that it bridged the 80-year gap between her heart and Elias's. Finding these letters in this God-forsaken place was like touching a raw nerve of history. It reminded Elias that he was not the first soldier to be haunted by a ghost, nor the first survivor to carry the weight of those left behind. The discovery left Elias shaken, the silence of the mountain now feeling populated by the whispers of Clara and her lost son. He stood up, intending to return to his work, when the world suddenly shifted with a violent, sickening shudder. A low, guttural roar echoed through the canyon, the sound of 1,000 freight trains colliding. The heavy rains from the previous week, followed by the sudden freeze, had loosened a massive shelf of rock and mud above the trail. Elias had no time to run. A deluge of slate and frozen earth cascaded down the slope, pinning his left leg against a massive, unyielding boulder. The pain was an explosion of white light, a sickening crunch of bone and sinew that robbed him of his breath. He collapsed into the cold mud, the weight of the landslide trapping him like a broken insect. The sky was darkening, the temperature plummeting, and as he looked at the sheer wall of the mountain, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he would not survive the night. He was miles from the truck, hidden by the curve of the cliff, and his voice was too weak to carry over the howling wind. Scout was by his side in an instant, his amber eyes wide with panic as he licked Elias's cold, sweaty face, his tail tucked between his legs in distress. "Go, Scout!" Elias wheezed, his fingers digging into the dog's thick, coarse fur. "Go! Find help!" But the dog didn't move initially, his loyalty anchoring him to the spot. Elias remembered a small, dilapidated hunter's shack they had passed on the lower trail, a place that felt hollow and abandoned. He had seen a coil of heavy hemp rope hanging from a rusted nail on its porch. If he could get that rope, perhaps he could tie it to a nearby pine and use his own weight to shift the smaller rocks pinning his leg. With the last of his strength, Elias grabbed a scrap of the oilcloth from the letterbox and bit into his thumb, using the warm blood to smear a crude SOS on the fabric. He tied it firmly to Scout's collar with trembling, frostbitten hands. "Run, Scout! Run for the rope!" The dog took off like a shot, a blur of gray and black disappearing into the encroaching shadows of the forest. For the next several hours, Elias drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. In the haze, he saw Sarah standing at the edge of the cliff, her green eyes weeping for him, and he heard the ghost of Miller's harmonica playing a dirge for the living. The cold was a predatory beast, gnawing at his extremities, turning his skin a sickly blue and his thoughts sluggish. He felt the seductive urge to let go, to simply close his eyes and join Sarah in the stars. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let the mountain reclaim what the desert had missed so many years ago. But then he thought of the letters. He thought of Clara Vance waiting 80 years for a son who never came home, and he realized that to give up was to betray everyone who had ever loved him. Life, he realized with a jolt of primal defiance, was not something you were merely given. It was something you fought for with every bloody inch of your soul. He heard the frantic, heavy panting before he saw the dog. Scout emerged from the tree line, his chest heaving, his paws bleeding and raw from the 5-mile sprint through the jagged forest. Clutched firmly in his jaws and partially draped over his shoulders was the coil of hemp rope, frayed and smelling of dry rot, but strong enough for one final effort. The dog had found the shack, navigated the pitch-black darkness, and returned through sheer force of will. With a surge of adrenaline that masked the agony in his leg, Elias grabbed the rope. Using a nearby sapling as a lever and the rope as a crude pulley, he groaned through the blinding pain, shifting the rocks just enough to slide his shattered leg free. He collapsed back into the snow, gasping as Scout curled around his frozen body, providing the life-saving warmth that would keep his heart beating until the dawn. As the first light of morning touched the peaks, Elias looked at the dog, then at the rusty box of letters. He wasn't healed, not yet, but for the first time since the war ended, he knew he wanted to live. The spade had struck the past, but the dog had secured his future. The first light of dawn crawled over the edge of the world like a shy predator, turning the frozen expanse of the lake below into a sheet of beaten silver. Elias sat on a low outcropping of granite, his left leg stretched out stiffly before him, bound in a crude but effective splint he had fashioned from pine branches and strips of his own spare flannel shirt. The landslide had left him with a deep, throbbing ache and a souvenir of purple-black bruising, but the bone had fortunately remained unbroken, a mercy he attributed more to the thick canvas of his trousers than to luck. Beside him, the small iron spade rested against a rock, its edge dulled by the stubborn permafrost. His hands, though still raw and mapped with fresh scabs, felt a strange, new steadying purpose. He looked at the rusted tin box containing Clara Vance's letters, then at the small urn of Sarah's wildflower seeds. A simple hole in the earth no longer felt sufficient for the weight of the memories he carried. He realized that Sarah hadn't just sent him here to bury her remains. She had sent him to build something that could hold the silence of the dead and the hope of the living. He decided then that he would not just pack up and leave. He would build a sanctuary, a small stone cathedral perched on the lip of the abyss, where the wind could recite Clara's letters and Sarah's seeds could find a permanent home. The work was grueling, a test of muscle and iron will that forced Elias to focus on the present rather than the echoes of mortar fire in his mind. He began to gather the flat slabs of shale and the heavy rounded river stones that littered the cliffside, dragging them one by one to a level patch of ground near the precipice. This was where Scout proved himself to be more than just a guardian. The German shepherd, sensing the shift in Elias's intent, transformed into a self-appointed foreman of the construction site. With an intelligence that seemed almost human, Scout began to sort the materials. The dog would sniff at a pile of rocks, nudging the thick, jagged granite blocks toward the corners where the foundation pillars would stand, and using his powerful snout to push the smoother, flatter plates of slate toward the center for the floor. Scout worked with a rhythmic intensity, his tail wagging in short, sharp bursts of pride whenever Elias patted his head for bringing a particularly useful stone. The dog seemed to understand the geometry of the task, his amber eyes assessing the rising walls with a critical, golden gaze. On the third day of construction, as the walls reached waist height, a visitor drifted into their camp. She appeared from the tree line like a mountain spirit, a woman in her early 30s named Elias Vance. No relation to the Clara of the letters, she claimed, though her eyes held a similar ancient depth. Elias was a nomadic artist and naturalist who had been tracking the migration of winter hawks through the high peaks. She was a woman of striking, wild beauty, her skin an olive bronze that spoke of 1,000 days spent under the sun, and her hair a chaotic tumble of raven curls tied back with a strip of dyed leather. She carried a vintage leather-bound camera slung across her chest and wore a heavy patched wool coat that smelled of sage and rain. Her eyes were like jasper, shifting between green and brown, and her personality was a curious blend of fierce independence and soft-spoken curiosity. She didn't offer help with the heavy lifting, sensing that Elias needed the labor for his own penance, but she sat nearby, sketching the rising stone structure in a charcoal notebook. Her presence was a gentle tether to the world of the living, a reminder that the world had continued to turn even while Elias had been stuck in the trenches of his own mind. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was like the sound of wind through dry grass, light, airy, and carrying a strange wisdom. She told Elias that the mountain didn't care for the why of his building, only for the how, and that every stone he laid was a word and a prayer he was finally brave enough to speak. As the sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cliff, the temperature would plummet, forcing Elias and Scout into the small shelter they had built. These nights were no longer filled with the terrifying staccato rhythm of gunfire or the screams of his fallen unit. Instead, Elias began a new ritual. He would light a small, flickering candle made of rendered fat and pull a letter from Clara's rusted box. In the golden glow, his voice, once rusty and hollow, began to find its resonance. He read the letters aloud to Scout, his tone deep and warm, a low rumble that filled the stone walls of their developing cathedral. He read Clara's words about the taste of fresh peaches in the summer of 1944, and her descriptions of the way the light hit the church steeple on Sunday mornings. He read about her son Thomas's favorite blue shirt and the way he used to whistle while he worked in the fields. Scout would lie at Elias's feet, his heavy head resting on the man's lap, his ears perked as if he were absorbing every syllable of the mother's love. The act of reading aloud was a form of exorcism. The sound of his own voice, speaking words of love and longing, began to occupy the spaces in his brain that had been colonized by the noise of the war. He was replacing the sounds of destruction with the sounds of devotion. Sometimes, Elias would catch himself smiling at a particular turn of phrase in Clara's writing, a rare and fragile expression that felt foreign on his weathered face. He realized that he wasn't just reading for himself or for the dog. He was reading for Clara, and for Thomas, and for Miller, whose harmonica still rested heavy against his heart. He was giving them a voice in the high, clean air of the North, ensuring that their stories weren't buried in the mud of history, but were instead sung out over the frozen lake. By the end of the week, the stone cathedral was nearly complete. It was a modest structure, barely larger than a shepherd's hut, but it possessed a rugged, timeless beauty. Elias had carved a small alcove into the back wall, a sacred hollow where he placed the rusted iron box of letters. He then spent hours meticulously polishing a large, flat piece of white quartz to serve as a pedestal for Sarah's urn. The physical exertion had changed him. His beige jacket was now stained with stone dust and sweat, and his hands were permanently etched with the grit of the mountain, but the tremor in his fingers had almost entirely vanished. He found that he could stand at the edge of the cliff and look at the vast, terrifying blue of the sky, without feeling like he was about to fall into an abyss of his own making. One evening, after Alara had shared a meal of dried venison and tea with him, she asked him if he intended to play the harmonica he kept so close. Elias looked at the silver instrument, the metal glinting in the firelight. For the first time, he didn't feel the sudden surge of guilt or the phantom smell of gunpowder. He felt a quiet, burgeoning responsibility. He told her that the stones weren't ready for the music yet, that a hymn required a foundation of silence before it could be sung. Alara nodded, her jasper eyes reflecting the flames, and told him that Sarah would have loved the way the stones caught the starlight. When she left the next morning, leaving behind a small pouch of dried sage, Elias felt a strange sense of loss, but also a profound gratitude. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was a builder, a narrator, and a man who was learning that a home could be built even on the edge of a cliff, as long as it was built with the rhythm of a song. The stone sanctuary now stood as a silent sentinel against the encroaching winter, its gray walls blending into the granite of the cliffside like it had been birthed from the mountain itself. Inside, the air was scented with the faint, sweet aroma of Sarah's wildflower seeds and the musty ancient ink of Clara's letters. Elias had found a rhythm in the stillness, a routine of carving stone and reading aloud that kept the shadows of his mind at bay. However, as the moon began to wane into a thin, silver sliver, a strange irregularity crept into the sanctuary's peace. It started with a missing strip of venison jerky Elias had left drying on a flat stone. Then, a small crust of sourdough bread vanished from his supply crate, followed by a handful of dried apples. At first, Elias blamed the mountain jays, or perhaps a particularly daring squirrel, but the thefts were too precise, too deliberate. The heavy wool blanket he had used to cover the letterbox had been shifted, and the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke, different from his own, lingered in the alcove when he returned from gathering firewood. Scout, usually a thunderous defender of their perimeter, had become uncharacteristically quiet about the intrusions. The German shepherd didn't bark or growl. Instead, he would sit by the entrance of the stone hut, his ears swiveling toward the thicket of ancient oaks that bordered the clearing. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold, Elias watched Scout stand up with a deliberate, gentle grace. The dog didn't look at Elias, but instead picked up a small, wrapped piece of honeycomb Elias had traded from Silas Thorne. With the prize held softly in his jaws, Scout trotted toward the tree line, his tail wagging in a slow, rhythmic sway of friendship. Intrigued and a little unsettled, Elias followed at a distance, his boots crunching softly on the frozen crust of the snow. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had once stalked through much more dangerous woods, his heart hammering with a mixture of curiosity and an old, protective instinct. Scout stopped before a massive, hollowed-out oak tree, its trunk so wide it felt like a gateway to another realm. The tree was a gnarled giant, its bark peeling in silver scales, and its roots clutching the earth like the knuckles of a buried titan. Scout leaned his heavy head into the hollow and let out a soft, inviting huff. From the depths of the shadows, a small, trembling hand reached out. It was a child's hand, pale, smudged with dirt, and tipped with bitten fingernails. Elias froze behind a nearby pine, his breath hitching. He watched as Scout gently placed the honeycomb into the small palm. A moment later, a figure emerged partially from the tree. It was a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, looking far too small for the oversized, tattered navy blue hoodie he was wearing. The boy's face was a heart-wrenching sight. His skin was the color of winter milk, his nose red from the cold, and his eyes, a deep bruised indigo, looked hollowed out, filled with a profound, heavy sadness that Elias recognized all too well. This was Leo, a boy who didn't look like he was running away from home as much as he was running away from the very concept of the world. Leo's hair was a chaotic nest of dark, unwashed curls, and he moved with a jittery, bird-like fragility. He didn't speak. He simply clutched the honeycomb and looked at Scout with a desperate, silent gratitude. Elias stayed in the shadows, realizing that any sudden movement would send this frightened creature bolting into the deadly cold of the mountain night. He watched as the boy reached out to bury his fingers in Scout's thick fur, leaning his forehead against the dog's frosted muzzle. In that moment, the fierce, battle-hardened veteran felt a crack in the armor around his own heart. He saw in Leo the same thousand-yard stare he had seen in his own reflection for decades, the look of a soul that had seen something it couldn't unsee, a spirit that had found the silence of the woods safer than the noise of people. Elias realized that the boy must have come from the small mining town 10 miles down the valley, a place where the air was thick with coal dust and broken dreams. Instead of revealing himself, Elias began a different kind of ritual. He became a ghost in his own sanctuary, leaving offerings near the hollow tree. He would leave a tin of warm stew, a pair of thick wool socks he had found in his truck, and even a small, hand-carved wooden bird he had whittled during the long afternoons. He noticed that Leo began to venture closer to the stone cathedral, though always when he thought Elias was asleep or away. One night, Elias sat by his small fire, intentionally reading Clara Vance's letters in a louder, clearer voice than usual. He could feel Leo's presence just outside the circle of firelight, a small shadow huddled against the outer wall of the hut. He read a letter about a mother's hope for a peaceful world, her words floating through the crisp air like a benediction. He felt Scout shift beside him, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the flames, knowing full well that their secret friend was listening to every word, finding a different kind of warmth in the stories of a stranger's love. The peace was nearly shattered when a new figure arrived on the mountain, Deputy Marcus Reed. Marcus was a man in his late 50s, with a chest like a barrel and a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a hatchet. He was the kind of lawman who believed in hard facts and iron rules, his gray eyes constantly scanning for trouble. He wore a crisp tan uniform under a heavy leather jacket that creaked when he moved, and his salt and pepper beard was trimmed with military precision. Marcus was a man burdened by the weight of a town that was slowly falling apart, and his voice held the weary rasp of someone who had delivered too many pieces of bad news. He had come looking for a runaway, his arrival signaled by the crunch of heavy boots and the jingle of handcuffs on his belt. He looked at Elias with suspicion, his hand resting habitually near his sidearm. "Old man, there's a boy missing from town, troubled kid, doesn't talk. His mother, well, she's in no state to care for him. You seen anyone?" Elias stood his ground, his beige jacket dusted with snow, his charcoal chinos stiff from the cold. He looked at the deputy, then at Scout, who was standing perfectly still between the officer and the hollow tree. Elias felt a surge of fierce, protective loyalty for the boy in the hoodie. He knew that if Leo were taken back now, in that state of raw terror, whatever light was left in him would be extinguished forever. Elias looked Marcus in the eye, his own gaze as steady and unyielding as the mountain granite. "I haven't seen any boys," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that brooked no argument. "Just me, my dog, and the silence. And I'd prefer to keep it that way, deputy." Marcus lingered for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the stone hut and the strange, solemn dignity of the veteran. Finally, with a sharp nod and a warning about the coming blizzard, the deputy retreated, his heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Once the sound of the deputy's engine died away, Elias walked toward the hollow tree. He didn't go all the way. He stopped 10 paces short and sat on a stump. "He's gone, Leo," Elias said softly, addressing the shadows. "You're safe here. The stones, they don't judge, and they don't tell secrets." A small movement from within the tree told him the boy had heard. Elias realized that his mission had shifted. This Vach Ja, this distant cliff, was no longer just a place for his own healing or Sarah's Dinguyen. It was becoming a sanctuary for the lost, a high-altitude harbor for souls that the world had tried to break. As he walked back to his hut, Scout trailing faithfully behind, Elias felt a strange sense of alignment. He was no longer just a broken soldier carrying a harmonica of guilt. He was a guardian of a new kind of peace. The breath of the stones was finally doing its work, not just for him, but for a boy who had forgotten how to breathe at all. The sky over the northern peaks didn't just darken, it collapsed, a vast vault of obsidian that swallowed the stars and the moon in a single, suffocating breath. The record-breaking blizzard arrived with the suddenness of an ambush, the wind screaming through the granite crevices like a chorus of banshees. Inside the stone sanctuary, the sanctuary that Elias had worked so tirelessly to build, the air grew dangerously thin and frigid. The roof, only partially completed with heavy shale slabs, left a gaping wound in the center of the structure, through which the swirling white needles of snow hissed and settled. Elias, his body already battered by the previous days of labor, and the lingering trauma of his leg injury, felt a sudden, violent chill seize his marrow. His breath became a visible, ragged vapor in the dimming light of his dying fire. By the time the midnight hour struck, a ferocious fever had set in, turning his blood into molten lead while his skin remained as cold as the ice on the lake below. He collapsed onto his bed of pine boughs and wool blankets, his beige canvas jacket pulled tight around his shivering frame, but the cold was a persistent predator that no fabric could keep at bay. As the fever climbed to dangerous heights, the barriers between the present and the past began to erode. The howling wind outside transformed into the screech of incoming mortars, and the white swirl of snow became the choking dust of a desert plateau from 30 years ago. Elias was no longer in the mountains. He was back in the burning iron of the 90s, pinned down in a trench where the air tasted of copper and cordite. In his delirium, he saw the faces of the men he had left behind, their features illuminated by the strobe light flashes of artillery. The PTSD, which he had tried so hard to quiet with the breath of the stones, roared back to life with a terrifying symphonic violence. He began to thrash against the blankets, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to push back the encroaching shadows. He was reliving the moment Miller fell, The moment the silver harmonica was silenced by a spray of crimson, and the noise in his head was so loud he couldn't hear his own ragged screams. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the desert sun, a blinding, hateful eye that offered no mercy, contrasting sharply with the freezing reality of the stone hut. He was caught in a lethal intersection of fire and ice, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that threatened to stop altogether. Scout, the faithful German shepherd who had been Elias's silent sentinel through every nightmare, recognized the shift in the air instantly. He didn't bark, he didn't pace. He understood that this was a battle that couldn't be won with teeth or claws. With a low, mournful whine that cut through Elias's frantic mumbling, the dog climbed onto the low bed. He moved with a deliberate, gentle authority, positioning his heavy, 8-year-old body directly across Elias's chest. The dog's thick, coarse fur, frosted with the gray of time, pressed against the beige canvas of the jacket, creating a living, breathing barrier against the cold. Scout draped his head over Elias's shoulder, his wet nose pressing against the man's scarred jawline. For the next 12 hours, as the blizzard raged with a fury that threatened to rip the stone walls apart, Scout remained motionless. He became a biological furnace, his own steady, powerful heart rate acting as a metronome for Elias's erratic pulse. Through the process of thermal bridging, the dog's internal heat seeped into Elias's core, slowing the tremors and fighting the hypothermic shock that had begun to shut down the veteran's organs. Leo, the small, indigo-eyed boy who had been hiding in the shadows of the sanctuary, watched from the corner of the hut, his face a mask of terror. He saw the way Elias's eyes rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and he heard the guttural foreign words of command Elias shouted to soldiers who had been dead for decades. Leo didn't run this time. The sight of Scout's unwavering devotion held him in place. The boy crept closer, his navy hoodie pulled tight around his ears, and added the last of the dry wood to the embers, his small hands trembling. He watched as Scout occasionally lifted his head to lick the salt-crusted tears from Elias's cheeks, tears that were a mixture of physical agony and the deep, repressed sorrow of a man who had forgotten how to weep for himself. The dog's tongue was a warm, rough comfort, a grounding force that whispered to Elias's subconscious that he was not in a desert, that the war was over, and that he was loved by a creature that asked for nothing but his survival. The symphony of the blizzard outside was countered by the quiet, rhythmic thumping of a dog's tail and the steady breathing of a beast that refused to let its master slip into the dark. In the deepest well of his fever, Elias felt a presence. It wasn't the ghost of Miller or the terrifying shadows of the trench. It was Sarah. She appeared in the golden light of a summer garden that existed only in his mind, her silver blonde braid shining and her green eyes filled with a fierce, protective joy. She didn't speak with words. She spoke with the warmth he felt on his chest. "I sent him to find you, Elias." Her voice seemed to echo through the corridors of his delirium. "I sent the stones to hold you and the dog to keep your heart beating. Don't go yet. The song isn't finished." Elias felt the pressure of Scout's weight, a heavy, grounding reality that pulled him upward, inch by inch, out of the black mud of his memories. He felt the coarse fur against his cheek and the rhythmic thump-thump of a heart that beat in perfect synchronization with the earth itself. The desert sun in his mind began to set, replaced by a cool, pale light that smelled of pine and ancient stone. He reached out a trembling hand and buried his fingers in Scout's thick neck, his breath finally evening out as the fever broke like a wave against a cliff. When the first light of the morning finally breached the horizon, the blizzard had died down to a whisper, leaving behind a world draped in a pristine, blinding white. The sun, a cold but brilliant diamond, shone through the opening in the roof, illuminating the scene inside the sanctuary. Elias opened his eyes, the gray ash color finally returning to a clear, lucid gray. He was weak, his body feeling like it had been through a crushing mill, but the fire in his blood was gone. He looked down to see Scout still draped across him, the dog's eyes open and watchful, though his own frame was shivering from the exhaustion of maintaining that heat for half a day. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob and half prayer. He realized that Scout hadn't just saved his life. The dog had bridged the gap between his broken soul and the world of the living. He looked at Leo, who had fallen asleep huddled near the hearth, and then at the silver harmonica that had fallen from his pocket during his thrashing. He picked up the instrument, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight of guilt. It felt like a piece of the symphony he was finally ready to play. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man who had been pulled from the fire by a love that was as ancient and unyielding as the mountains. The morning of the final 48 hours arrived not with the whisper of spring, but with the thunderous, earth-shaking heraldry of heavy iron. The air, once filled with the breath of the stones and the soft rustle of pine needles, was now choked by the acrid, industrial stench of diesel exhaust and the mechanical screech of hydraulic arms. Two massive yellow excavators, looking like prehistoric predators birthed from a nightmare of steel, crawled up the narrow mountain pass, their heavy treads crushing the delicate wildflowers Sarah had dreamed of. Leading the convoy was a black heavy-duty truck, out of which stepped Grant Sterling, the man hired to oversee the physical erasure of Elias's sanctuary. Grant Sterling was a man forged in the furnace of rigid discipline and unyielding duty, a retired military engineer who had spent 30 years turning obstacles into dust. At 55, he possessed a frame that seemed carved from oak, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun, and a jawline as sharp and uncompromising as a bayonet. His hair was a silver-flecked buzz cut, a stark contrast to his sun-bronzed skin, and his eyes, a piercing metallic slate, looked like they had seen the collapse of empires without blinking. Sterling was a man of efficiency, a man who believed that orders were the only universal truth. His personality a wall of granite that no emotion could penetrate. He wore a high-visibility vest over a tactical jacket, a clipboard gripped in his hand like a shield, and he moved with a precise, heavy-footed cadence that signaled the end of the piece. Beside him, Julian Graves stood with a triumphant clinical smirk, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the yellow steel of the machines. "Commence the clearing, Captain Sterling," Julian commanded, his voice thin and sharp against the mountain wind. "The law has no more patience for sentiment." But as the engines roared to life, a secondary sound began to rise from the trailhead, a low, rhythmic thrumming that wasn't mechanical, but human. From the shadows of the forest emerged a phalanx of the forgotten. It started with Silas Thorne, leaning on his gnarled staff, followed by Martha Gable and Arthur Pym. But behind them came hundreds more, the families of the mining town, the shopkeepers, the teachers, and the veterans who had heard the story of the man of the cliff. They didn't carry signs or weapons. They simply moved in a silent, unstoppable tide, forming a living wall of flesh and bone around the stone sanctuary. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a mosaic of weathered faces and determined eyes, their presence creating a barricade that the excavators couldn't breach without crushing the very community they were meant to serve. The silence they projected was a physical force, a collective no that resonated through the canyon like a subatomic hum. Grant Sterling halted, his hand raised to stop the machinery. He looked at the crowd, at the grandmothers in their Sunday coats and the young men with their hats over their hearts, and for the first time in his career, his slate-colored eyes showed a flicker of hesitation. He looked at Elias, who stood at the center of the storm, his beige canvas jacket covered in the white dust of his final carvings, his hand resting on Scout's heavy shoulder. The German shepherd sat like a bronze statue, his amber eyes fixed on Sterling, with a calm, discerning wisdom that seemed to bypass the uniform and speak directly to the man beneath. Julian Graves began to shout, his face reddening with a bureaucratic fury, demanding that the trespassers be removed by force. But Sterling ignored him. The commander stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the stone cathedral. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the wall where Elias had been carving until the very last second. Elias stood aside, allowing the commander to reach the highest point of the granite face, where the light of the rising sun hit the stones with a celestial brilliance. There, etched in deep, reverent letters into a block of pure white quartz, was a name that made Grant Sterling's clipboard slip from his fingers and clatter unnoticed onto the rocks. The name was Captain Samuel Sterling, The commander's breath hitched, a sound of raw, unvarnished pain that seemed impossible coming from a man of his stature. This was the grandfather he had never known, the man who had vanished in the closing days of World War II, a ghost whose missing status had been a hollow ache in the Sterling family for 3 generations. Elias had found the name in a forgotten military registry Leo had brought from the town library, or perhaps it was a whisper from the letters of Clara Vance. But there it was, enshrined at the apex of the sanctuary, recognized and honored in a way the government never had. The legal monster crumbled in an instant. Grant Sterling reached out a trembling, calloused hand and traced the letters of his grandfather's name, his thumb lingering on the sharp edges of the stone. The steel in his eyes dissolved into a well of tears that he didn't try to hide. The man of orders realized that he had been sent to destroy the only grave his own blood had ever received. He turned back to the demolition crew, his voice cracking, but regaining a new, more profound authority. "Shut them down!" he roared, the command echoing through the canyon like a benediction. "Shut the engines down! This isn't a construction site. This is hallowed ground." Julian Graves stepped forward, his mouth open to protest, but Sterling silenced him with a single glacial glare that carried the weight of a lifetime of combat. "If you want this wall moved, Graves, you'll have to drive the machines yourself, and you'll have to go through me first." The standoff broke not with a fight, but with a collective sob of relief that rippled through the hundreds of people gathered on the cliff. The demolition turned into an impromptu memorial service. People began to step forward, touching the stones they had brought, sharing stories of the names Elias had carved. Grant Sterling took off his tactical jacket and sat on the ground beside Elias, the 2 men, one who lived for orders and one who had been broken by them, sharing a silence that was finally, truly peaceful. Scout moved through the crowd, his tail wagging with a rhythmic grace, offering his warmth to the weeping and his presence to the lonely. He stopped at Sterling's side, resting his head on the commander's knee. The man who had come to destroy the sanctuary ended up kneeling before it, his forehead pressed against the name of his grandfather, finally finding a closing chapter to a story of loss that had spanned 80 years. Elias felt a profound lightness in his chest, a sensation of the armor finally falling away. He reached into his beige jacket and pulled out the silver harmonica. He looked at the crowd, at the boy Leo, who was smiling for the first time, and at the vast frozen lake that was now beginning to crack and shimmer with the arrival of spring. He put the instrument to his lips. The first note he played wasn't a dirge or a scream. It was a clear, soaring melody that carried the breath of the stones out into the infinite blue. It was the music Miller had played in the trenches, but now it was a hymn of homecoming. As the music drifted over the peaks, the people joined in, a chorus of voices rising to meet the stars that Sarah had promised would heal him. The sanctuary was never demolished. It became a national memorial of the heart, protected by the very men who had been sent to tear it down. Elias stayed on the mountain, no longer a hermit, but a caretaker of a temple of kindness. He realized that Sarah hadn't sent him there to hide from his pain, but to transform it into a bridge for others. Sometimes God doesn't remove the burden. He brings a community to help you carry it. As the sun set on the distant cliff, Elias, Scout, and the hundreds of souls they had touched stood together, a family birthed from stone and faith. The war in Elias's head was finally over, replaced by the eternal, quiet symphony of a promise kept and a love that refused to die. The late February sun hung low and heavy in the sky, a pale gold coin that offered a deceptive warmth against the lingering bite of the mountain frost. Below the sanctuary, the frozen lake remained a vast, unyielding mirror of white, but the air had begun to change, carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp pine needles and the awakening earth. The silence of the high peaks was no longer a hollow void. It had become a living, breathing thing, vibrating with the quiet industry of a man who was no longer building a house, but a legacy. News of the man of the cliff and the angel dog had begun to trickle down into the valley like snowmelt, carried by the weary breath of Deputy Marcus Reed and the cryptic grunts of Silas Thorne during his rare visits to the town's general store. The stories spoke of a veteran with eyes of ash who had built a cathedral from nothing, and a German shepherd that possessed the soul of a guardian. To the lonely and the forgotten in the mining town below, Elias became a myth, a man who had mastered the art of carrying grief without being crushed by it. One by one, they began to make the arduous journey up the mountain, not to offer charity or to gawk at a hermit, but to find a home for the ghosts they had been carrying in their own pockets for far too long. The first to arrive was Martha Gable, a woman of 75 who looked like she was made of iron and lace. She was small and sturdy, with hands that were gnarled like the roots of the ancient oaks, her skin translucent and mapped with the blue veins of a life spent in hard labor. She wore a faded floral scarf tucked neatly into the collar of a heavy moth-eaten wool coat, and her eyes were the color of dried lavender, soft, yet holding a steely, unblinking clarity. Martha had lost her husband, a deep-sea fisherman, 30 years ago, and she had spent 3 decades talking to the empty chairs in her kitchen. She didn't come with a plea. She came with a gift. In her pocket, she carried a jagged piece of limestone from the foundation of the house she and her husband had built together before the ocean claimed him. She found Elias working on the western wall of the sanctuary, his beige canvas jacket now gray with stone dust, his charcoal chinos stiffened by the mountain grit. Scout, sensing the arrival of a soul that held no malice, didn't bark. Instead, he rose with a fluid, welcoming grace and trotted toward Martha. With a gentle nudge of his frosted muzzle, the dog guided the elderly woman toward a flat, sun-warmed slab of slate that Elias had meticulously polished. Scout waited until she was seated, then rested his heavy head on her knee, his amber eyes offering a quiet, wordless companionship. Martha didn't say much at first. She simply watched Elias work, her weathered face softening in the golden light. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thin, melodic trill that seemed to vibrate against the stones. She told him that her house was too quiet, and that the limestone she brought was the only piece of her forever she had left. Elias, his voice no longer rusty but deep and resonant like a church bell, accepted the stone. He didn't just place it, he carved a small sacred niche into the wall and set the limestone into the heart of the sanctuary, cementing it with a mixture of mountain clay and his own unwavering purpose. The word spread further, and soon Arthur Pym followed. Arthur was a retired watchmaker, a man who seemed to be composed entirely of thin wires and trembling glass. He was nearly 80, his frame so frail it seemed a stiff breeze might carry him over the precipice. He had a long, pointed nose and a shock of white hair that stood up like dandelion down, and he moved with a jittery, meticulous precision. Arthur's life had been one of seconds and minutes, but since his daughter had moved to the coast and stopped calling, time had become a vast, terrifying ocean. He brought a piece of rose quartz, a stone that had once been the centerpiece of a fountain where his daughter used to play. Arthur was a man of intense nervous energy, his hands constantly moving as if he were still adjusting the invisible gears of a clock. Scout greeted him with a calm, grounding presence, leading the old man to a seated position where the sound of the wind through the pines mimicked the ticking of a celestial timepiece. Elias realized that he was no longer just a builder, he was a curator of memories. The sanctuary was evolving into a memory wall for the entire community of the broken. Each person who arrived brought a fragment of their past, a piece of granite from a lost farmstead, a river stone from a dry well, a shard of marble from a forgotten monument. Elias integrated each one into the structure, carving dates and initials, with the precision he had once used to map enemy territory. He was building a mosaic of human resilience, a stone hymn that acknowledged that while everyone carries a burden, no one has to carry it alone. The breath of the stones that Sarah had whispered about was no longer a metaphor. It was the collective sigh of a dozen lonely hearts finding a place to rest. Scout took his role as the host with a solemn, canine dignity. He seemed to know exactly where each visitor needed to sit, and which person needed the warmth of his body against their legs. He became the foreman of souls, his presence a bridge between the grim silence of Elias and the fragile hope of the guests. When the evenings grew cold, Elias would lead them into the finished portion of the sanctuary. He would light the fire, the orange glow dancing off the walls of mismatched stones, and he would read Clara Vance's letters aloud. The elderly visitors would sit in rapt silence, their faces illuminated by the flames, listening to the words of a mother from 1945 as if they were a fresh broadcast of hope. In those moments, the noise of Elias's war was completely drowned out by the gentle communal breathing of people who were rediscovering the beauty of being heard. Leo, the boy in the navy hoodie, became the silent apprentice to this growing congregation. He no longer hid in the hollow tree. He sat in the shadows of the sanctuary, his indigo eyes wide with wonder, as he watched Elias turn raw stone into a sanctuary of stories. Leo started to help, his small hands picking up the smaller pebbles to fill the gaps between the larger memory stones. Elias noticed that the boy's tremor had vanished, replaced by a focused artistic intent. The sanctuary was healing the child just as it was healing the veteran and the elders. It was a place where the young learned that pain could be transformed into beauty, and the old learned that their stories were worth more than the dust of time. One afternoon, as the sanctuary walls reached their peak, Elias stood back to survey the work. The building was a chaotic, beautiful masterpiece of different textures and colors, a physical manifestation of the valley's shared history. He felt the silver harmonica in his pocket, and for the first time, he felt the urge to play, not to summon the ghosts, but to honor the living. He looked at Scout, who was sitting proudly at the entrance, and at the small crowd of elders who had gathered to watch the final stone being laid. He realized that Sarah had sent him here not to hide from the world, but to build a place where the world could finally find him. He wasn't just a soldier who survived. He was a man who had built a home out of the very rocks that had once tried to crush him. The stones were finally speaking, and they were singing a song of homecoming. The first whispers of March carried a different kind of chill, not the biting frost of January, but the damp, heavy scent of thawing earth and the inevitable approach of the world Elias had tried so hard to leave behind. The stone sanctuary, now a sprawling mosaic of shared grief and silent prayers, glowed under the pale morning sun, its walls thick with the memory stones brought by the valley's lonely inhabitants. But the peace of the high cliff was shattered when the mechanical growl of a modern SUV echoed through the pines, followed by the arrival of a man who looked like he was made entirely of ink, paper, and cold iron. This was Julian Graves, the regional director of land management, a man whose soul seemed to have been replaced by a leather-bound rulebook. Julian was in his mid-40s, possessing a sharp predatory thinness that made his expensive high-tech mountain parka look out of place. His face was a study in clinical detachment, high, razor-sharp cheekbones, a thin, lipless mouth that rarely curved into a smile, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, translucent, and devoid of warmth. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light like mirrors, shielding his thoughts from the world. Julian was a man of the city, a man who believed that the world could be managed, measured, and filed away in a cabinet. He carried a heavy briefcase as if it were a weapon, and his movements were precise, clipped, and utterly devoid of the mountain's natural rhythm. Behind Julian stood a small crew of 3 men in orange safety vests, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the shadow of the stone cathedral. They were local men from the valley, their faces weathered and their hands calloused, but today they were the instruments of the state. Julian stepped forward, his boots crunching on the sacred ground Elias had leveled by hand. He didn't look at the beauty of the stones or the intricate carvings. He saw only an unauthorized structure on federal parkland. Without a word of greeting, he pulled a sheaf of documents from his briefcase and held them out. His voice was like the sound of dry parchment rubbing together, monotone, devoid of emotion, and final. He informed Elias that the sanctuary was a violation of multiple safety codes and land use permits. It was built without a foundation, on protected soil, and it was to be demolished within 48 hours to restore the natural integrity of the ridge. Julian spoke of liability, zoning, and sovereign territory, words that sounded like foreign curses in the thin, pure air of the peaks. Elias stood motionless, his beige canvas jacket stained with the dust of 1,000 carved stories, his charcoal chinos stiff with the grit of the earth he had bled for. Beside him, Scout rose to his full height, his frosted muzzle low, his amber eyes fixed on Julian with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. The German shepherd didn't growl. He simply existed as a mountain of fur and muscle between his master and the man with the paper. Elias looked at the documents, then at the memory wall behind him, at Martha's limestone and Arthur's rose quartz. He felt a surge of the old fire in his chest, the hot, jagged anger of the soldier who had seen too many beautiful things destroyed by men in suits. But as his hand drifted toward the silver harmonica in his pocket, he remembered Sarah's voice. He remembered the breath of the stones, and the way she had taught him that the strongest force in the universe wasn't the one that struck, but the one that endured. He didn't take the papers. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. Instead, Elias turned his back on the director and walked toward the sheer granite face of the cliff that formed the sanctuary's rear wall. With a slow, deliberate movement, Elias picked up a fine-tipped steel chisel and a heavy mallet. The demolition crew watched in confusion as the veteran began to work. The first strike of the hammer echoed through the canyon like a gunshot, but it was a sound of creation, not destruction. Elias began to carve. He didn't carve his own name, nor Sarah's. He began with Miller, P., the kid with the freckles and the harmonica. Then he carved Thomas Vance, the son Clara had waited 80 years for. He carved the names of every man from the valley who had gone to the desert or the jungle and never come back to see the apple trees bloom. His movements were rhythmic and sacred, his focus so absolute that Julian Graves seemed to fade into a mere shadow against the brilliance of the stone. Each strike of the mallet was a heartbeat, a declaration that these lives mattered and that this ground was now consecrated by the names of the fallen. Scout took his position at the entrance of the sanctuary, sitting with the rigid, stoic grace of a sentry at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The dog's presence was an invisible wall, a silent guardian that made the men in orange vests hesitate. They looked at the names being etched into the granite, names they recognized. One of the workmen, a burly man named Caleb, whose beard was salted with gray, suddenly took off his hard hat and stepped back. He had seen the name Miller and remembered his own uncle who had died in a trench far from home. The authority Julian Graves projected began to dissolve in the face of Elias's silent, artistic defiance. Julian stepped forward, his voice rising in an uncharacteristic display of irritation, demanding that Elias stop the vandalism of public property. But Elias didn't even flinch. He continued to carve, his hands steady, his gaze fixed on the granite as if he were pulling the names directly out of the mountain's soul. The silence that followed Julian's outburst was more powerful than any shouting match. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, filled only by the clink, clink, clink of the chisel and the steady breathing of the dog. The legal monster found itself powerless against a man who refused to acknowledge its teeth. Julian looked at the names, then at the dog, and finally at the veteran, whose beige jacket seemed to blend into the very landscape he was defending. For the first time, Julian's pale eyes wavered. He saw that he wasn't just fighting a hermit. He was fighting the collective memory of an entire people. He was trying to demolish a place that had become the only grave some of these men would ever have. The legal documents in his hand suddenly felt like dead weight, lifeless, meaningless scraps of paper against the eternal weight of the carved granite. The elders of the valley, Martha, Arthur, and Silas Thorne, began to appear at the edge of the clearing, having been alerted by Leo, the boy who had run down the trail at the first sign of trouble. They didn't bring weapons, they brought their presence. They stood in a semicircle around the sanctuary, a silent phalanx of gray hair and weathered skin, their eyes fixed on Julian Graves. Silas Thorne, leaning on his gnarled staff, didn't say a word, but his milky eye seemed to see right through the director's suit to the hollow space where a heart should have been. The tension was a living thing, a taut wire stretched across the precipice. Julian looked at the crowd, then at the memory wall, and finally at the name Thomas Vance, which Elias was currently finishing. The breath of the stones seemed to rise in a collective gale, a spiritual wind that made the director's high-tech parka feel like thin tissue paper. Julian Graves eventually retreated to his SUV, his face a mask of cold fury. But he didn't give the order to start the bulldozers. He realized that to destroy this place now would be to spark a fire in the valley that no law could extinguish. As the vehicle drove away, the dust settling on the pines, Elias finally stopped carving. He put down the mallet and the chisel, his hands covered in white stone dust, looking like the hands of a ghost. He turned to look at the crowd, then at Scout, who finally relaxed his posture and let out a soft, approving huff. The threat wasn't gone forever. The law is a slow, relentless beast. Inhung for today. The sanctuary stood. Elias realized that the miracle Sarah had sent him to find wasn't just about his own peace. It was about the power of the quiet, the sacredness of the memory, and the courage to stand still while the world tried to move you. He felt the silver harmonica over his heart, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a relic of war. It felt like a song of victory that didn't need a single note to be heard. The mountains had finally exhaled the last of the winter's breath, giving way to a spring so vibrant it felt like the earth itself was trying to overcompensate for the months of gray silence. The sanctuary, now officially recognized as a community cultural landmark, sat atop the distant cliff like a crown of living history, its stones weathered but glowing with the collective spirit of the valley. Flowers, the very wildflowers Sarah had dreamed of, began to erupt from the crevices of the rocks, their colors of violet, gold, and crimson spilling over the precipice like a silent, floral waterfall. Elias stood at the threshold of the stone hut, his beige canvas jacket now a part of his skin, and his charcoal chinos bearing the honorable stains of clay and quartz dust. He was no longer the shadow of a man fleeing the echoes of war. He was the guardian of a sacred archive, a man whose silence had become a sanctuary for others. Beside him, Scout rested on a bed of dried moss, his movements notably slower than they had been during the blizzard. The German Shepherd was nearing his 9th year, and the stiffness in his joints was evident as he stood, but his amber eyes remained as bright and piercing as two sun-warmed gems. He was the angel dog of the legend, a creature whose gray-frosted muzzle and gentle rhythmic breathing were the steady metronome of Elias's new life. A new visitor arrived as the silver disk of the June moon began to climb over the eastern ridges. A young woman named Evangeline Rossi, a freelance historian and photographer from the state capital who had been sent to document the sanctuary for a national archive. Evangeline, or Eva as she preferred, was in her late 20s, possessing a sharp, inquisitive intelligence that was balanced by a deep, innate respect for the weight of human memory. She was lithe and energetic, her skin the color of warm honey, and her hair a vibrant, untamed copper that glowed like a dying ember in the twilight. Her eyes were a clear, startling emerald, a shade that momentarily made Elias's heart skip a beat as he thought of Sarah, though Eva's gaze held a restless, modern fire rather than Sarah's grounded peace. She carried her professional cameras with a practiced ease, and her personality was a refreshing blend of urban sophistication and a genuine, almost childlike wonder at the world Elias had built. She had lost her own father, a firefighter, to a blaze 10 years prior, and though she didn't speak of it immediately, the way she touched the memory wall told Elias that she understood the architecture of loss. She didn't just take pictures, she listened to the stones, her copper hair blowing in the mountain wind as she captured the way the moonlight hit the name of Captain Samuel Sterling at the apex of the cliff. Ava sat with Elias and Scout as the night deepened, the silver light of the moon turning the world into a landscape of obsidian and quicksilver. She asked him about the harmonica, her voice soft and melodic, lacking the intrusive edge of a typical journalist. "They say the music here is different," she whispered, her emerald eyes reflecting the flickering firelight of the hearth. Elias looked at the silver instrument in his hand. It was no longer a cold, heavy relic of the trenches. It was an extension of his own soul. He told her about Miller and about the long, terrifying nights where the only thing keeping the darkness at bay was the sound of these very reeds. He told her that for decades, he had believed the music was a trap, a way for the ghosts to pull him back into the mud. But here, on this cliff, with the wind acting as his accompaniment and Scout as his witness, he realized that the music was a bridge. It was the only way to carry the names of the fallen into the light. As the moon reached its zenith, bathing the sanctuary in a surreal, heavenly glow, Elias finally put the harmonica to his lips. He didn't play a march or a dirge. He played a symphony of the quiet, a slow, sweeping melody that seemed to rise from the very roots of the mountain. The notes were clear and haunting, vibrating through the stone walls and carrying out over the frozen surface of the lake, which was now beginning to ripple with the first movements of the summer thaw. The music told the story of a soldier's pain, a wife's promise, and a dog's unwavering love. It was a sound that didn't hide from the past, but used it as the foundation for every beautiful note. Scout, sensing the sacredness of the moment, let out a soft, contented huff and rested his chin on Elias's boot. The dog's eyes were half closed, his tail thumping a slow, happy rhythm against the stone floor, a bark of peace that harmonized perfectly with the harmonica's song. Ava watched, her camera forgotten in her lap, her own eyes moist with the beauty of the scene. She saw in Elias a man who had finally stopped running. He was no longer carrying his pain somewhere meaningful. He had arrived. The Vach Jah, the cliff, was no longer a destination. It was a home. Elias realized as he played that he didn't need to forget the desert or the noise of the artillery to be whole. Those fragments of his life were the very things that gave the music its depth. He was using the broken pieces of his past to build a reality that was warm, vibrant, and filled with a quiet faith. The war in his mind had been replaced by a celestial hymn, a song that honored Miller's sacrifice and Sarah's vision. As the final note drifted away into the starlit sky, leaving only the gentle whisper of the pines, Elias felt a profound, unbreakable serenity. He looked at Scout, then at the names on the wall, and finally at the copper-haired girl who would tell his story to the world. He was a veteran, a builder, and a musician of the spirit, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, undeniably free. The golden hour had arrived, drenching the distant cliff in a light so thick and honeyed, it felt as if the air itself had turned into liquid amber. It was late spring, and the sanctuary had been transformed from a lonely stone hut into a vibrant, breathing ecosystem of memory and hope. The memory wall was now nearly hidden beneath a tapestry of wildflowers, the very ones Sarah had dreamed of. There were clusters of sky-blue lupines, golden poppies that caught the sun like spilled coins, and deep crimson paintbrush flowers that swayed in the gentle mountain breeze. These weren't just wild growths. They were gifts from the townspeople, who hiked up every weekend to plant a new seedling or pull a weed, ensuring that Elias's cathedral was never without color. The scent was overwhelming, a heady mixture of damp earth, sweet nectar, and the clean, sharp tang of pine resin. Elias sat on a low stone bench he had carved near the entrance, his back resting against the granite names of his fallen brothers. His beige canvas jacket was worn thin at the elbows, and his dark charcoal chinos were dusted with the pollen of a dozen different blossoms. At 62, the lines on his face no longer looked like scars of battle. They looked like the grooves in a well-loved instrument. His star-shaped scar remained a pale silver mark of his past, but the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, immovable stillness. Beside him, Scout lay with his paws crossed, a posture of regal serenity. The German shepherd was now firmly in his senior years, his muzzle a soft, snowy white, and his movements dictated by the slow, rhythmic ache of old bones. Yet, his amber eyes remained as sharp as ever, scanning the trail with a vigilant, protective love. He was no longer the restless soldier. He was the elder statesman of the cliff, a creature that had moved from guarding a man's sanity to guarding a community's peace. He let out a long, contented sigh, his tail thumping twice against the stone floor, a sound that Elias found more comforting than any music. Together, they watched the world below, where the lake shimmered like a fallen sky, and the valley began to tuck itself into the shadows of the coming evening. The city Elias had fled felt like a different lifetime, a gray dream that had been bleached away by the brilliance of the mountain sun. A figure appeared at the bend of the trail, moving with a heavy, hesitant gait that Elias recognized with a jolt of visceral empathy. It was a young man, perhaps no older than 23, dressed in a faded olive drab field jacket and sturdy hiking boots that looked too new for the dust of the mountain. This was Corporal Jackson Jax Thorne, not a relative of Silas, but a namesake of the many young men the valley sent away and rarely received back whole. Jax was lean and wiry, his frame still carrying the high-tension energy of the front lines. His hair was buzzed short, revealing a scalp tanned by a sun much harsher than this one, and his face was a study in repressed exhaustion. He had a sharp, angular jawline covered in a few days of dark stubble, and his eyes, a piercing, troubled gray, held the unmistakable, thousand-yard stare. He looked hollowed out, as if the person he used to be had been replaced by a ghost that didn't know how to navigate the silence of home. He carried a small, tactical rucksack slung over one shoulder, and his hands, which gripped the straps tightly, were marred by a slight but persistent tremor. Jack stopped 10 paces from the sanctuary, his gaze fixed on the memory wall. He didn't see the flowers at first. He saw the names. He saw Miller, P, and Sterling, S, and he felt the weight of his own unspoken losses pressing against his lungs. He looked like a man standing on the edge of an abyss, unsure if he should jump or turn back to the noise he left behind. Elias didn't move. He didn't stand up with the authority of a superior officer, nor did he offer the hollow platitudes of a stranger. He simply continued to stroke Scout's head, the rhythmic motion a silent invitation. He waited for the mountain air to do its work, for the scent of the poppies to reach the boy's senses, and for the dog's calm presence to act as a tether. Scout lifted his head, his ears swiveling forward, and let out a soft, low huff of greeting, a sound of recognition between two souls that had walked through the fire. Finally, the young soldier took a step forward, then another, his boots crunching softly on the shale. He reached the porch of the stone hut and stood there, swaying slightly, the smell of wood smoke from Elias's hearth finally breaking through the metallic tang of his memories. He looked at Elias, searching for something he couldn't name. Permission, perhaps, or a sign that the war truly ended when you put down the gun. Elias looked up, his ash-gray eyes reflecting the warmth of the setting sun. He saw the boy's trembling hands and the way his shoulders were hunched as if expecting an incoming strike. Elias moved over on the stone bench, making a space that had been worn smooth by the hundreds of lonely souls who had come before. "Sit down, son," Elias said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that held the weight of 40 years of healing. "The stones are warm here." Jax hesitated for a heartbeat, then collapsed onto the bench. The moment his weight hit the stone, a long, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound that was part sob and part surrender. He felt the heat of the granite, warmed by the day's sun and the collective prayers of the valley, seeping through his jacket and into his tired bones. It was a warmth that felt alive, a solid foundation that didn't shift or crumble. Scout stood up slowly and walked over, resting his heavy frosted chin on the boy's knee. Jax's hand drifted down, his fingers burying themselves in the dog's thick fur. And for the first time in months, the tremor in his fingers began to subside. He looked at the vast horizon, at the stars beginning to blink into existence over the peaks, and he felt the breath of the stones Sarah had promised so long ago. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver harmonica. He didn't play it yet. He just held it in the light, the metal glinting like a promise kept. He realized that this was the true Disan, the legacy. It wasn't the building itself, nor the fame that Ava Rossi's photos had brought. It was this moment of transition, the passing of the torch of peace from one broken soldier to another. The Vak Ja was no longer a place of death, or a monument to the past. It was a nursery for the future. He looked at the wildflowers surrounding them and thought of Sarah, knowing that she was smiling somewhere in the golden light. He had carried his pain to a meaningful place, and in doing so, he had built a bridge that would remain long after he and Scout were gone. The symphony of the mountain was finally complete, a harmony of stone, soul, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog that had refused to let a man stay in the dark. As the first notes of a quiet hymn drifted from the harmonica into the night air, the world felt whole again, and for the first time, the silence was enough. The journey of Elias and Scout is a profound testament to the enduring power of the human spirit when anchored by love, loyalty, and a promise kept. What began as a lonely flight from the shadows of war evolved into a sacred sanctuary of collective healing, proving that our deepest wounds can become the foundation for our greatest purpose. Through the simple acts of carving stone, reading letters, and listening to the silence, a broken veteran transformed a barren cliff into a cathedral of kindness. This story reminds us that no shadow is too dark for the light of faith to penetrate, and no heart is too shattered to be mended by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a faithful companion. It is a celebration of the community found in shared grief and the quiet strength of those who choose to build bridges instead of walls. Elias didn't just find a place to bury his past, he found a way to breathe life into it, turning the noise of his trauma into a soaring hymn of homecoming that will echo through the valley for generations to come. In our own lives, we often wait for a miracle to fall from the heavens in a flash of lightning. But, as Elias and Scout discovered, God often speaks in the softest whispers, through the unwavering gaze of a loyal dog, the delicate blooming of a wildflower in the snow, or the warmth of a shared seat on a stone bench. A miracle isn't always the removal of our pain. Sometimes the true miracle is the divine strength to carry that pain to a place where it can be transformed into a blessing for others. When your own road feels steep and the winter of the soul feels never-ending, remember that you are never walking alone. God's grace is present in the small, everyday moments of kindness and the silent faith that guides us home. If the story of Elias and Scout has touched your heart today, please share this video with someone who might be walking through their own valley. We invite you to leave a comment below with your own stories of healing, or simply share a prayer for those still seeking peace. Please subscribe and join our community as we continue to share tales of faith and inspiration. May God's peace go before you, His strength sustain you, and His light shine upon your path every single day. May He bless you and your loved ones with comfort and joy, today and always. Amen.